Welcome to the Exploratory and Animated Data Visualization lecture, part of the Principles of Data Visualization lecture series. Our conversation today will begin with exploratory data visualization. The first thing that we want to understand about exploratory data visualization is that it is an analytical technique and different and unique from descriptive data visualization. Descriptive data visualization we use exclusively to communicate. So we may have a visual example, a chart that enhances a text story. Perhaps it is a single frame visualization and it's used to communicate. Exploratory data visualization is a dynamic process and it's used as an analytic technique, just like statistical analysis would be used as an analytical technique. Now, the purpose of exploratory data visualization is to communicate and or leverage human capabilities. So as humans, we have certain spatial reasoning types of capabilities, comparative capabilities, and exploratory data visualization is designed to use an interactive process using this unique human capability. Now, in exploratory data visualization, data is the bridge. So we have to have data to create that data visualization, and particularly when we make adjustments, when we're interacting with it, data is sort of this constant bridge that's cycling through the interactivity to help us understand the trends and the dynamics that may be going on at the center of the phenomenon that's creating the data. Now, visualizations are representations of phenomenon. So as we've discussed before, the phenomenon is at the very center, and then data, much like taking snapshot photos, snapshot pictures of a phenomenon, data is the observations of that phenomenon. So the two are different. The phenomenon is the thing, the data are representations of the thing. And ultimately, our objective is the effective communication of insights. So what we're trying to do with data visualization is improve an understanding of what's going on with that phenomenon, what it's all about, how it works, what are its dynamics. Now, I think it's useful at this point to reference the original father of exploratory analysis, John Tukey. So John Tukey developed this concept of asking great questions, having a particular creative or curious attitude about exploring data sets, being flexible enough to change our perspective, to change the hypotheses of what we're trying to determine. In many ways, analyze without a hypothesis. Basically, just try and find out what's going on with a reliance on display. And this is a tip of the hat that John Tukey provides to the process of data visualization, where you have to be able to see it. And one of Tukey's main contributions to the field of data visualization is this box plot. Many of you may already know what this is or may have used them before. It's also called a box and whisker plot, sort of the box at the center and a whisker on top and below. But what this is in essence, it's a data distribution, sort of like a histogram that's been put on its side. And so at the very center of it, the line at the center of the box, the 50th percentile, that's the median. If we go to the bottom of the box, that's the 25th percentile. And then we go to the top of the box, that's the 75th percentile. And then each of the whiskers, the whisker on the bottom, is the minimum value up to the 25th percentile. And then the whisker on the top is the 75th percentile up to the maximum value that was observed in that collection of data. And then optionally, the mean can also be included as that plus or cross within the box. And what this helps us do is basically give a proxy for what does that distribution look like. Now we can see from the one that's represented here that this isn't a completely uniform bell curve of a distribution. So we see that a great deal more distance between the 50th percentile and the 75th percentile. So that distribution has a wider range than the 25th to the 50th. So the 25th to the 50th has a smaller range to it. So we can kind of see and get a sense based on this box plot what that distribution might look like. Now, we also utilize similar techniques in the world of financial exploratory visualization. So some folks may have had experience with the candlestick chart, which is our first frame here on the left-hand side. And let me describe what this data visualization is. So it is much like a trend line. It has a particular pattern, just like a trend line would. Upward movements, downward movements. So much like a trend line, it has that behavioral perspective to it. But it has a unique feature. Instead of having a single plotted point at each particular point in time, it has one of these sort of box and whiskers plotted. And so to have an appropriate representation, instead of a single plotted measurement, typically for the data sets that are involved here, there's a whole distribution or a whole range or series of data points that's occurring at that exact point in time. So even if it's a particular second in a day, there's going to be a large number of, for example, stock trades that are made all at that 1 second in time. We have basically what we might deem a box plot plotted at each particular point in time. Now, a little bit more about that box plot. It is a distribution, and it represents, a range of measurement values. It also has a particular encoding, unique encoding to it. So we can see some of the similar features that we had in the box plot. So we see the opening price of the day is the bottom of the box. The closing price of that particular day is the top of the box. And then we have whiskers for the low price of the day and the high price of the day. Now, one other piece of encoding occurs if the particular price is an increase, the box will be encoded in white. And if it's a particular decrease, the box will be encoded with black. And so we can see from the plotting of whether the box is null or shaded that it is moving upwards when it's null or a white box, and when it's shaded, the price movement goes down. And we can also see a difference in the box and whiskers at each particular instance in time are not uniform. So you could have a much longer box here that would say we have a much wider distribution, and some of them that are much shorter. So the trading's in a much tighter range. And with all respect due to John Tukey, this particular technique was used a couple hundred years before Tukey invented the box plot. Recently discovered by a researcher and author named Steve Neeson. And this particular type of charting was used originally for Japanese rice trading several hundred years ago. So another example of how we're looking at sort of an exploration in each of these, what would be plotted points. There's actual a distribution we can explore in addition to the trend line that it's a part of. And now we're looking at a closely related example, at least in terms of its purpose, that's provided to us by Edward Tufte. And it's an invention that Tufte coined spark lines. And so what a spark line is you may have something that is traded. So here, in this visualization, it happens to be foreign currency. In this case, it's euros. But it could be yen or dollars or Canadian dollars or something else, some other type of currency there on the left. And for that matter, it could be stocks or bonds or something else. Now, on the farthest left-hand side, that's the word. Basically, it gives us the category that we're discussing, whatever the tag that helps us understand what this particular measurement is about. And then we have a number. So our number's in red, and we have the opening and closing price there, and then which is basically considered the number. We also have out to the side the low price and the high price of that particular day. That could also be, so in this case, the first one happens to be for a period of 65 months. And then to the right there, it's for a period of 12 months. But this could just be trading for a day. It could be trading for a month. Often measurements like this are reported for the day and 52 weeks, which would be 1 year. So we have a number of numbers there that's sort of forming a data table. But then, and this is Tufte's contribution, there needs to be some context of the measurement. And so that's where we see the little trend lines that are between the opening and the closing prices. And it works sort of like this. We desire to know, desire to know the opening and the closing price, but we also desire to know what was the pattern, how low did the price go during the day, how high did it go, and what was the steepness of that increase or that fall. And so spark lines give us that context. And it might also be best understood in thinking about it in the not condition. So let's assume we didn't have this little trend line. We didn't have the spark line, and we just had the measures. So in this case, it's entirely possible that over the course of the day, a particular stock or security might have opened at one price. Perhaps it opens at $1. It closes at $1.01, and we think, not much happened that day. But perhaps some of the things we didn't see or couldn't see is that in the early part of the day, the price went up by several 100%. And then midday, it went down by several 100% as compared to the opening price. So it may have oscillated 200, 300, 400% during the day, and then it closed near the price that it opened at. Now we can know in a data table what the opening price, what the closing price was, and the low and the high. So we would see the peak and the valley in that pattern in the data table. But what we wouldn't know is all the other in-between price movements that occurred that may have been a particular pattern. So now let's take a look at Tufte's invention in reference to baseball. So a little bit different context. So take a look at this visualization. Start on the left and then scan across to the right. Okay, so you've probably had a couple of minutes to get a sense of what am I looking at, and let me help to fill in any blanks that might be there. So at first we have a label, American East, so this is a particular division of teams in baseball. And we see, the first thing we see is that spark line, sort of that pattern or trend line for what's going on with that particular team. Now, the next column we see tells us the number of wins greater than their losses. So this is basically the net column of wins minus losses. So we can see some teams like the New York Yankees, which is the team name in the third element there, are 40 games more winning, 40 more wins than losses. With Boston, 34 more wins than losses. When we get down to Baltimore, it's actually more losses than wins. So we define that as a -6. Tampa Bay, more losses than wins by 22. And then Toronto, 27 fewer wins. The next column that we see next to the label for the team is going to be the win and loss ratio. So we have, for the New York Yankees, 101 wins, 61 losses, and that's what accounts for the 40 more wins than losses. We can also see, the next column over, the home record. So how many of these games were played at home? And at home, how many were won and how many were lost? And then the next column over is on the road, how many games were won and how many were lost. Often there's a particular home field advantage. The crowd's much nicer to the home team than the visiting team. So often there is an effect there, and we can see a difference in data. Then we can take a look at the overall winning percentage. So that's the next column over. So in the case of the Yankees, it's .623. And then take a look at the last visualization there and see if you can figure out what's going on. So as some of you guys may have determined, these tick marks, these whiskers, sort of this whisker visualization, is to help lay out the pattern of wins versus losses. So if there's a win, that's a tick mark or a whisker upward from the center. If it's a loss, it's a tick mark downward from the center. So we can look at the pattern, wins versus losses. Now, why would this be valuable? Well, it's possible that the Yankees started off the season and they were just really doing spectacular. So they were winning every game they had. So let's say that they won 101 games in a row, and then they started losing. And they went on to lose the next 61 games in a row. Now that would give us a very different impression than a team that won a few, then lost a few, then won a few, then lost a few. Because the team that won a few, then lost a few, we might think them to be a little bit more balanced. Now, if it was the team that won 100 games and then lost 60 plus games, we might think something fairly significant happened between when they were winning and when they were losing. And that might give us a very different impression about that team based on the sequence of wins and losses. And so that's why we see the visual representation out to the right there. Now, as well, I'll highlight to you that this visualization also cleverly encodes whether they were home games or not. So if they were home games, you'll see a center line in the visualization. And if they were away games, you will not see that particular center line. So now we'll take a look at another exploratory visualization known as Mary's Trains. And I'll give you a couple minutes just to take a look at it, see if we can figure out what's going on with it, and then we'll begin to discuss it. Okay, So some of you may have begun to pick up that there are a number of towns and cities in Northern California represented on the left-hand side in a column. And some of you may have been even more specific and noticed that these are basically routes from the south of San Jose northward to San Francisco, listing or defining several cities and towns in between the two. And what this is basically an overview of a train schedule. So what is the train schedule between San Jose and San Francisco? There's several things to take into account here. So we now know what the y-axis is, but a couple of things we haven't fully distinguished. Take a look at the sequence of the cities and towns and see if you can figure out what's going on there. So what you might find is that all of the cities and towns are organized, not in alphabetical order, but in geographic sequence from the furthest north in San Francisco to furthest south of, in this example, San Jose or Tamian. So we have a unique organizational structure of our rows of towns and cities there that's based on geography. Along the x-axis, we have the particular 24 hours in the cycle of a day. So it starts off with 4, 5, 6, runs till noon, then labels 1 through 12 for midnight, and then picks up the 1 and the 2 before we engage the 3 and the 4 on the other end to cycle this again. So that gives us sort of a setup of what is this visualization. Now let's look at it's sort of the main body of the visualization. So notice that on some of these lines we have a particular dot for every location that's on the left-hand side. So this is what's known as a normal train, perhaps you might call it a local, that it stops at every station. And the way that this particular data visualization is used is someone may be in San Jose, they need to get to work in San Francisco in the morning, and they have to make a 7 a.m. meeting. They decide, well, I also don't want to pay a bunch extra because I'm just commuting to work. So they might choose the 2 black routes that stop at each station. Might be slightly more annoying, but it's certainly cheaper. So they take that option. Now they also could have taken an option with limited. So a limited means it's not going to stop at every stop. And then the bullet train, it's only going to stop at a couple of stops. So there's some variability that I can turn on or turn off with this normal, limited, and bullet train settings. Now take a look at the slope of these diagonal lines. See if you can see some differences there. So one of the things that you may notice is that the slope of the normal train lines is the least steep. Now, what does the slope mean in this particular data visualization? Well, if it's a less steep slope, that means it's going to take more time to get from one train station to another. But if it's a much steeper slope of the line, as we might see in the limited, or a very steep slope in the line that we might see in a bullet train, the amount of time that an individual spends on the train will be reduced as they move from normal, limited, and bullet. And the way this is represented is with the slope of the line. And remember that that particular slope of line aligns with the time slots down at the bottom and down at the top when someone might get on the train, and then when the train arrives for them to get off. Now, some of the patterns can be different on weekdays versus Saturday and Sunday. It's a little bit out of the scope of our conversation. I mean, it's certainly there, and we acknowledge it. But what we're looking at right here is primarily a weekday data visualization. And the utility in this type of visualization is to allow folks to know if they're in one of these cities or towns on the left-hand side, when can I be in another town or arrive at a different location at a particular time. To help understand the exploratory visualization process, we'll first take a look at some of the work of Card, McInlay, and Schneiderman in how data visualization is created. So we begin with raw data. So these are our observations of a phenomenon. From that raw data will be turned into, basically transformed into some type of data table. So we have, and you can think about it as at this point in data tables, we will know what our variables are, what each field is, and what the metadata is regarding each of those fields. Then from there, from the data tables, we will create visual mappings. So those particular visual mappings are taking those fields or data values and turning them into visual structures. So think about Bertin's 8 variables. We're basically taking that data, encoding it with different visual variables, and then we're going to convert those structures into an overall view. So if you think about transformation, so what's going on in a transformation, we're taking what may be a number of plotted points or bar charts or shapes. We have many of those that we've created from our visual structures, and then we're going to put them all together into one view. So you might just think about a bunch of plotted points or a bunch of bar charts, and then we create a view of all of those plotted points or bar charts or both into that end state of a view. Now, another model that helps us understand sort of an iterative or interactive dynamic with data visualization is called iterative loops, provided by Ben Fry. So with iterative loops, there's a particular process that you step through to create data visualization. So first we acquire data sets. We may parse them, basically focus them, cut them down, clean them up, perform some manipulation of that data set. Then we might filter some of the data and focus in on a smaller or more appropriate data set. We then might take the step of mining it. So mining it is basically applying data mining techniques to that enhanced data set. Then we'll create a representation. So whether it's a box plot or a distribution or a bar chart, plotted points, a geomap, whatever it is, we'll then create a representation. Then we go through a process of refining it. So that first representation you can consider to be a rough draft. And then finally, after we refine it, we have a last step that is an interact, basically where we're trying to smooth out publishing grade version of whatever we've created. Now that's a straightforward process, and you guys no doubt have experience with business processes as multi-step, so that's probably not too surprising. But one of the unique things that Ben Fry brings to this visualization process are called iterative loops. And so we'll take a look at those. So the first one we might look at when we get to represent. So in represent, the programmer analyst might consult with the statistician. Okay, so we're seeing some cross-functional activity going on here. And this is probably the appropriate time to explain that what's envisioned in using this business process flow to create great data visualization is some interactivity and cross-functional teamwork between the programmer analyst or the IT analyst, a statistician, and then a designer. So 3 different unique skill sets that are all critical to make data visualization work well. So let's step through the process up until represent. So perhaps the programmer analyst, they figure out how we're going to acquire this data. We get it acquired. They help to parse the data, basically get it cleaned up. And then in some cases, the programmer analyst will also do the filtering work. So these first 3 steps, they're basically readying the data. And then when we get to the mining stage, the statistician is going to take over as an expert data mining. They're going to mine that, figure out what the trends and patterns are, and then we will come to the representation. So the representation is the first place where the designer takes the feedback from the programmer analyst and the statistician, provides some suggestions about what should be built, and then the programmer analyst goes ahead and builds a rough draft of the data visualization. Now there is these iterative loops, so when that representation is built, it might be necessary to go back to the particular filtering process step. And we might receive some perspective there that the programmer analyst is consulting with the statistician and decides, hey, we've got to go back and change what the data set is. So if we have to go back that far, we're at acquire, we may completely change how the data set is originally extracted. It also might not need to be filtered in a different way and basically focused in a different way. And it's from that feedback of the statistician, the programmer analyst knows how to either re-extract or adjust the data set through filtering. Now, once the process, good rough draft representation is agreed to, then of course it goes through the refine step. It's improved a great deal by the designer, and then you get to the interact step. And at the interact step, the designer will consult with the programmer analyst about what that refined view should look like. And the programmer analyst is going to be working closely with the designer basically making suggestions about the best way to communicate with that data, and the programmer analyst basically building it. And then there's also interaction that the designer may consult with the statistician and say, well, you actually might want some of those mining techniques to be available in the interaction. And so the extent to which those are made available is a conversation between the designer and the statistician. So the unique part about this particular process is these iterative loops. And it's completely appropriate and the norm that data visualization is not a sort of a one-shot or single creation type dynamic. There are going to be a number of drafts or versions of a particular data visualization comes through the analysis. Now, we would not be complete without mentioning the Ben Shneiderman's information-seeking mantra. It's also foundational, and it works like this. Ben's idea was to have an overview, basically the wide angle, and then zoom in on the part that you're interested in. If necessary, filter the data set, and then either hover or click to get details on demand. And This information-seeking mantra has been around for a considerable period of time, several decades, and has been a standard that data visualization has utilized. But it's also worth noting it's not the only way to create effective data visualization. And within the last 5 to 10 years, there have been a couple of different research teams that have come back and said, no, it's actually more important to start an analysis on the part you care about, which would actually be the details. So you might, start this, very specific thing. Then you might step back and take a little bit wider view of this. So you might adjust the data set, some of the filtering to get a larger context of what's going on with that part you care about. And then you might zoom out to the larger view to say, okay, what's the total context, the overview, if you will, that this thing that I care about is involved in. We're not necessarily prescribing that there's just one way, but we're providing this information-seeking mantra just as an awareness that it is an approach. The reverse approach is also just as effective and maybe slightly more important looking ahead, in that a number of the technologies we have, we may search for something in a search engine. We may be analyzing a very specific part of something. That's what we really care about. And then we try and figure out what context this particular part of the world is occurring in. So now, speaking about data visualization more broadly, we can have a number of new objectives. So we're not just constrained to, hey, we're going to describe something. We're going to describe some data. We also can utilize it as an analytical technique. Now, in order to utilize data visualization as an analytical technique, there has to be a much higher degree of visualization literacy. And you can think about it as our literacy rate is heavily tied to reading. We can read, and so we open up this large cross-section of knowledge in the world through the skill of reading. And visualization is very much the same. Once you've learned how to read data visualization, it opens up a much, much larger capability of spatial reasoning, putting together visualization, animating that visualization, and a number of other techniques. Now, the idea in exploratory data visualization, as well as others, is to adjust the form to meet audiences. So part of what we're trying to do is satisfy an audience and perhaps provide them with something new. There currently is a fairly significant shift to different forms of media. So where some of this approach may have started off rooted in statistical exploratory analysis, graphical theory, into information visualization theory, it's now advancing into video shorts, maybe slightly longer documentary films, and animation. In terms of our audience preferences, they're consistently shifting from more text and static type representations toward the more visual and dynamic type representations of media. So what does all this mean? What is data visualization? So I've done my best to provide a good working definition for what is data visualization. It is visual representations of a phenomenon, because remember that the phenomenon is always the thing that's at the center, using data measurements. So our data measurements are our observations, perhaps our snapshots of data, as the defining characteristics for communication of evidence. And so we have to remember what's our goal here. So eventually our goal is going to be to take these data measurements about the phenomenon and turn them into effective communication of evidence. We're going to make a point. We're going to argue a case. We're going to demonstrate a trend or communicate a trend with our data visualization. Now, visualization, as we've begun to discuss, has many different forms. So visualization can be a representation of insights, so basically descriptive. And in descriptive visualization, we'll put together plots, basically plotted points, charts, maybe some diagrams. But what we're doing is simply describing a particular phenomenon or the behavior of a phenomenon. Exploratory data visualization is a method of analysis. It leverages our human capabilities, things like spatial processing, and we're studying the relationships between different data elements. And often we will utilize animation or motion for analysis. And so often we are, instead of doing side-by-side comparisons with descriptive visualization, we're advancing, iterating, or playing particular interactive models so that we understand the trends, the behavior pattern, the inner workings, different data variables given different contexts and other variables. And then in forms of communication, we have emerged data stories, narrative visualization, as well as documentary narrative visualization. So basically, the stories provide context in a better reception from general users or humans. Data stories tend to be our operating system. So as we select forms of communication, often these three or varying forms will assist with that process. Now we have multiple avenues of communication. So as an example, we might have internal communication inside a company. We might create dashboards or performance scorecards where we see how our company is performing, or portals where folks can go and get information or scenarios. We also have the emergence of journalistic frameworks and applications. So we see a lot more data visualization in journalistic stories. We even see exclusive data visualization-based stories. And so some good examples can be found at the New York Times, The Guardian, Economist. And we've even advanced to organizations like ProPublica has created online applications utilizing data visualization to better understand a phenomenon and the data that represents it. And then finally, we have video-based communication. So as a particular example, if you look at some of the more traditional journalistic type communication frameworks, so you might have a written text story and then you enhance it perhaps with a chart or two. So what's happening over time is the user preferences are shifting a great deal toward video. The very recent past, YouTube has just surpassed the mark. I believe it's a billion hours of video is being watched each day. We have preferences of page hits on the YouTube site outnumbers the New York Times 3-1. So we have sort of a proxy of a competition there where the New York Times is considered to be a traditional journalistic framework where we have text-based stories and sometimes we enhance those. Where YouTube is also communicating information but fully in video form. At the present time, and at least for the foreseeable future, the trend will continue where we're consuming more and more video and perhaps less historic journalistic frameworks. Now, it's not always so simple just to say this one good and this one bad, because the New York Times also has one of the most successful data visualization labs in the world and actively creates video journalism as well as video-based data-driven journalism. So it's not uncommon to find some of our best examples of data narratives provided by organizations like the New York Times and the Guardian. And sometimes those are even cross-referenced. You'll also find some of the New York Times data stories are also out on YouTube. The main thing we want to communicate here is there already is a strong trend, and that trend will likely continue towards more video-based communication. Now, we also want to have a quick but simple conversation about the differences in scales. So predominantly, this relates to perhaps an x-axis or y-axis, but there's some differences in how we represent that. So first is the linear scale. And just like it sounds, the linear scale will always have an increment of a single value. So we can see here we start with -6 at the left, go to -5, -4, -3, -2, -1, until we get to 0. Then we advance 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And notice that it has an increment of 1 each time we move along that particular scale. The logarithmic scale works a little bit differently in that it multiplies by a factor of 10 at each step. So we see kind of the same pattern here where we might have a 10,000th, then we move to 1,000th, then a 100th, a 10th, then a whole unit, then a factor of 10, factor of 100, factor of 1,000, factor of 10,000, each one of them representing a multiplier of 10 in each of its steps. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because sometimes we'll need one of these scales or the other to actually see a pattern or a trend in our data set. We may use a linear scale and we can't see anything different about it, but when we apply the logarithmic scale, perhaps we have a whole lot more data, or the data is structured in a way that allows a logarithmic scale to present a better pattern than what a linear scale might. So I encourage to explore both of these. And now that we've got that pre-positioning and understanding out of the way, we're probably ready to have a conversation about animated data visualization. So here we have Gapminder. Gapminder is one of the original, certainly the most popular data visualization applications that was animated. And so there's a few things that we want to discuss about how Gapminder is structured before we open it up and take a look at it. So first we'll have our x-axis. So along the bottom, the x-axis, we see this is income per person. So basically this is GDP per capita, and basically it's the gross domestic product of any country divided by its population, which is going to give you income per person. So that's what we have along the x-axis. And notice that that particular scale is logarithmic. It is not linear. And in this particular data set, we need that logarithmic type of scale so that we can see what's going on in the behavior of this data. On the y-axis, we have the life expectancy in years. So individuals, how long will they live? This is often put forward as a measurement of human health, so the life expectancy. And here we see a more linear scale with increments of 5, which is fairly simple to understand. Each of us understands what 5 years is in the human life, and that's what these different levels of measurement are separated into on the y-axis. Okay, now how does this thing work? So we have that x and y axis, and we're going to have plotted points at the cross-section or the intersection of that x and y values. So we're also going to use the X and Y axis for labeling of those two variables. So here we have income per person and life expectancy. Each one of the particular plotted points is a country. So that's the first time we're mentioning it now, but what we're representing here is for particular countries, we're going to have a circle or a plotted point that is the cross-section of the income per person and life expectancy. And then if we want, we could turn on a set of labels for each of these circles that basically rides along with the circle on its animated journey that tells us what country it is. In our case, and most people that use this tool tend to turn off the labels for each of those circles and instead just use a particular highlight or details on demand, basically a click on the object to see which object or which country it's representing. Now with that example, our z-axis, basically the circles, is encoded with size. So the size of a particular plotted point could be smaller if it's a very low population or much larger if it's a large population. So we're using that z-axis as size. And then we also can include variables used in the z-axis by utilizing a tooltip for exploration. So if you use that tooltip, we click on a particular circle, we might see the country name and some of the values that we cared about. For example, a simple one like population. Now color is used to encode each global region. So you'll notice when we take a look at this that each region, say North America or Europe or Asia, those each have a different global region. And we will highlight that again, but be looking for the unique use of color. The time variable is encoded below the x-axis. So if we look below the x-axis, there's a play button there, and that's where we're going to be basically making adjustments, or more to the point, just pushing play and watching time increment. Now behind the visualization, you'll see a background is used for the particular year. So this is a fairly clever usage all the time that the movement of these particular plotted points is used, there's going to be a need to reference back to what time is it. And yes, we could look down on the time scale, but we can avoid our audience ever having to look at different places on the screen by simply having that as a background, which is a fairly clever way to represent the time in terms of the year as an audience is viewing the visualization itself. I also want to note the source links in the visualization. So we'll see that the source of this application, working in coordination with Hans Rosling, Gapminder was built with Google. And if we open up some of these metrics, they will be listed with their source of the data. This is a very important aspect to highlight somewhere on the screen or near the selectable data values whose data this is. And then a couple comments about user experience. So the user experience is going to be an animation of frame increments. So we're going to look at a number of different frames using the play button. And it's important to understand that animation is basically a whole bunch of snapshot still images that are moved through in sequence such that they look like a whole set of or a moving picture. Now, Specifically, when we get into this application and begin to look at it, there's going to be a process of interpolation. And what interpolation is, that we have particular data measurements that might be in one particular cross-section of X and Y. And then we have another one in the next year here. Now, in order to avoid it looking like our plotted points jump around from one particular cross-section to another, we utilize a process of interpolation, which basically is an averaging the distance between the 2 points, and it inserts a whole bunch of average values between the two such that the circle moves smoothly. Now, speed can be increased or decreased. So with the feature near the play icon, we can speed up or slow down the presentation of the video or interactive experience. Our X and Y variables can be changed. So with the simple drop down, we can change either of those. And then our axis scales can be changed from linear to logarithmic. And so let's go out and take a look at Gapminder. So here we are with the interactive exploratory Gapminder application. Again, highlighting a few of the aspects. We have the particular variable that we're going to look at on the x-axis here. So we could choose lots of different, we could have lots of different choices here, but in this case, we're going to leave it at income per person because this is sort of a unique view of this particular type of data. Notice that we have the choice of a linear or logarithmic scale. So we're going to use the logarithmic here. On the y-axis, we have life expectancy in years. And so in the same way, and we could choose something different, but we're not going to. And we could also alter the scale. Now we're going to use a linear scale here. Notice that we have equal, not necessarily equal increments, but meaningful increments on the logarithmic scale, and then equal increments on the linear scale. Couple other things to see. So each one of these particular circles, these plotted points, is a country. And you're seeing a tooltip show up. When we take a look at each one, we're seeing the country name or label show up as a tooltip. The size of our particular plotted points is defined by the population. So we have a variable of population, of course, just like the X and Y variables. We could change that, but we're going to leave it as population. And then we could also just adjust, if we wanted to, particular size of those plotted points. Again, we're going to leave them pretty much the same. A couple other things. So we have our time scale here. So the time that these particular data points reference. So we're going to start back here at 1800. We have basically the ability to play and have animation, and we can affect the speed at which it plays using this particular feature. Notice that we utilize color as an encoding variable here by region of the world. And so that gives us a little better sense of each country, what place in the world is it. And this makes a lot of sense. So let's think about why might this design choice have been made? Why use the encoding of color for region? I mean, we could have encoded each one of these in a completely different color. I mean, that capability exists and is easily available. So why do this? The reason is to bring the audience swiftly into the conversation. So for all of us, one of the first things we begin to think about is, okay, where do I live? Where am I from? And what color is it? We're basically hunting. Where am I? Where am I in this whole understanding of data? So which of these countries is appropriate? So we're all kind of hunting ourselves in the visualization. And that's a very normal way that an audience will approach a data visualization. They think about themselves, how do I connect to this particular visualization? And this color encoding helps to guide the audience into the visualization. So based on the color, we might start looking for a particular country that we're associated with. Maybe we grew up there, maybe we're aligned with it. We might get an idea of, okay, this is where I'm from. And then I might want to see my country in the context of all the other countries. And so to give a view of how this animation works, we'll just go ahead and press play. And what we see is through time, each of the particular countries, their life expectancy, so the individual health of the individual might increase. We'll also see the financial health of individuals in those countries improve as well. Okay, so you guys have sort of a sense of how this works. Now, we will come back to some of the meaning that is explored through using this interactive tool set. We'll come back to documentary data narrative video created by Hans Rosling, the creator of this particular technique. But before we do that, we'll also perhaps create a more specific view of some of this data. So we might find some particular countries that we think are very interesting, we come from, or we think are very interesting. So I'm going to pick up Rosling's home country as well. My best pal from graduate school is from Iceland, so we'll go ahead and pick that one up as well. And for good measure, we'll also pick up China. And then we'll take a look at some of the same, so our approach, but notice that we've highlighted certain countries and we've faded back the others. And you guys may notice that we have turned on what are called the trails. So in addition to the current position of that country, we're also seeing the historical path or trajectory of that country over time. Okay, and we can also turn off the trails. And take a look at how these different countries advance in terms of the financial and biological health of their citizens over time. Okay. And here we'll wrap up with an overview of all the countries all together progressing over time. Okay. And now that we've had a sense of the application built by Hans Rosling, we also want to engage where a lot of this is heading. And my field of research and where I think a lot of this is heading, I've termed documentary data videos. And documentary data videos are videos that capture animated data visualization. So if you can imagine, we're interacting with a particular data visualization. It's an exploratory data visualization. And so imagine if the whole time we were interacting, we captured the insights that we found, sort of an entire video of the insights that we found, and then we created a story of the presentation of that interaction and that discovery of insights. That's a pretty good description of what we're going to find in documentary data videos. Now, data visualization is the primary component of the visual channel. So in order for it to be a documentary data video, the video has to be about data visualization. It has to be the most important, strongest component in the visual. We can also have a verbal voiceover. So one of the key components of documentary film is borrowed here, and we utilize that verbal voiceover to improve data retention and data recall. So basically, whenever we add that verbal voiceover, we're opening up a second channel, both the visual as well as the audio channels. They're both open for consuming information. And if we use the two of them together, our audience is likely to retain the information much better and be able to recall that a little bit later if they're quizzed about the content of the data. Documentary data videos, just like documentaries, present evidence and they make a case. They're making a position. They're making a point. They're wanting to bring better understanding to a particular topic, just like documentary data videos. Documentary data videos also borrow from documentary film, where multiple modes of documentary are utilized. So the first, participatory mode, next, observational, and then the third, expository. And we'll discuss each one of these modes. So the participatory mode. So when we're utilizing the participatory mode or constructing a documentary data narrative in participatory mode, the video has the creator and includes the creator of the data visualization as a character in the video. So they're, as a person, involved, represented in the visual channel as part of the video. So some examples to relate to the participatory mode in documentary film. So Michael Moore, the documentary being Roger and Me, Michael Moore in Fahrenheit 9/11, as well as Morgan Spurlock in Super Size Me. The unique thing about these three documentaries is that in the first two, Michael Moore is a character in the film, as well as Morgan Spurlock in Super Size Me is the main character in the film of Super Size Me. So this is where we get the definition of the participatory mode. Next, we will review Hans Rosling in probably one of the most famous documentary data narratives to date.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go. First, an axis for health, life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400,000, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
So in the observational mode, the audience is a fly on the wall, observing the events in the film. So the creator, the filmmaker, is invisible. They are not a character in the film. They are completely invisible, transparent. They are only acting in pointing the camera for the audience as that fly on the wall. So some examples in documentary film might include the documentary Gimme Shelter, about a tragic Rolling Stones concert, as well as a documentary probably more notorious called Triumph of the Will by the documentary filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl. Probably most of us have seen, probably often recoiled from some, but this particular film is what probably many of us have come to understand the Nazi regime through a particular rally of that political party that was filmed by Riefenstahl. So these two, the particular approach to the film is simply to turn on the camera and allow the audience to see what's going on. Now, in the observational mode, we're going to take a look at another documentary data narrative called Charting Culture. And in this particular documentary data narrative, the visualization is encoded in this way. So famous people are represented by different plotted points that have a particular color. The X and Y axis variables are engaged because we're plotting points on a map. We basically have a geolocation, basically two different measures that we're plotting. A particular plotted point begins as a birth of a famous person, and it will be represented with color encoding of blue. There'll be a plotted point for that famous person's death that will be color encoded with red. And then there's an arc of life between those 2 points, so from the birth point to the death point, that basically shifts color from blue to purple to red. Now, a couple other things that are going on in the encoding here is a high degree of overplotting. Now, in this case, the overplotting of points is actually used as a technique. It's creating a constructed Z size variable. So if you'll remember from the Hans Rosling video, we use that Z size variable to encode the size of the population. So the smaller circles were smaller population countries, and the larger circles, for example, India and China, were the larger circles. So we're using the size variable. Now, in this particular data visualization, the overplotting forms a cluster, if you will, of lots of plots, and it's actually used as a technique to highlight the popularity of that particular location. So if you have a whole bunch of little plotted points, there's an overplotting, which in essence creates the form of a very popular city, either for being born in or for dying in for famous people. So now that I've given you sort of an overview of how the visualization in this documentary data narrative works, we'll take a look at the documentary data narrative called Charting Culture. And remember, our encoding, this is a famous people, particular famous person is born in one place. We have a plotted blue point there. That's their birth. We have an arc of their life, and then the location of their death is plotted in red as a plotted point. So take a look. I think you'll enjoy.
The great Renaissance artist Leonardo da Vinci was born near Florence. Known throughout Europe, he was employed by the King of France late in his life. He died in Amboise in the Loire. Da Vinci is one of over 100,000 notable people whose birthplaces and deathbeds have been mapped in this animation. It's the work of a team led by Maximilian Schich, based at the University of Texas. The team wanted to chart hundreds of years of culture. Births are blue, deaths are red. Let's start in the Far East. This is 17th century Japan, just opening up to the west. Many of these names are Christian missionaries to the country, some persecuted here for their faith. In 19th century Australia, migration from Europe increases the traffic. If you watch this full screen, you might make out some names, among them the infamous bushranger Ned Kelly, born in the 1850s. His father was Irish, transported to Australia for stealing pigs. Back in time now to the Roman Empire. There goes Galen, physician and surgeon, on his way from Greece to settle in Rome. The powerful Roman Empire drew learned people in from all over Europe and beyond. Cultural subcentres began to emerge, like Cordoba in Spain and Paris and Avignon in France. From the 12th century onwards, all roads no longer lead to Rome. Migrations between other places are common. It's a little like a map of budget airline destinations. As time goes on, we can see that Paris attracts far more cultural migrants than other French cities. Whereas in Germany, several centres compete evenly for migrants' attention. Even small towns can be attractive cultural centres. Look at the Côte d'Azur in southern France, popular since the late 19th century. These data are from Freebase.com, a catalogue of well-known people and places owned by Google. In the 1600s, many European-born explorers looked west, striking out to the Americas. Among them, a fur trader originally from the English countryside, governors from Spain and France looking after islands in the West Indies, and military men. These are early settlers and military folk. You might recognise some of these names. On the left, there goes John Washington, great-grandfather of George Washington, the first President of the United States. John was born in Essex, England. The trend was to move from the rural European countryside to the burgeoning cities of the US, Boston, New York, Washington, hosts to more deaths in red than births in blue. But that starts to change. Look at all the blue now, as people build communities and the population on the East Coast expands. Most often people move into and along river valleys. From the 18th century onwards, gradually, look how people are starting to move to the west coast and living out their days there. That little cluster on the coast is San Francisco. Transport links make it easier to get from one coast to the other. First trains, and then affordable cars. Around the 1920s, there are still more births than deaths on the East Coast. Notable people begin to flock to Meccas like Hollywood in Los Angeles. This depiction makes clearer the pull of the West Coast cultural centres, where people move during their lifetimes. And many well-known names look for a haven for their twilight years. Next, the team would like to look at how Enlightenment thinking and the religious landscape overlap with their cultural maps.
Now, the third type of documentary data narrative is called the expository mode, and that comes from the documentary film literature describing expository mode. And what it means, what its essential elements are, is a methodical presentation of indexical evidence. And so what we mean by that is it's a consistent presentation of an argument using evidence. And what we mean by indexical is we're presenting models. So we might present, this is what this looks like. So we might have some sort of animated model. We might have some type of representative example of what the evidence looks like. The second component of it would be the authoritative voice of God audio narration. And so this has a long history in documentary film. It's one of the sort of essential elements that many folks associate documentary film with, is that sort of strong, confident voice in presenting the narration as the evidence is presented. It uses narrative storytelling. So this presentation of evidence tells a story. It is consistently represented by a narrative arc, basically some type of beginning, middle, and end, or more sophisticated story arc. It creates rhetorical proofs. Rhetorical proofs are basically different arguments, be it ethics, logic, or emotion. It creates particular proofs to help make the case for what's being represented in the film. And so some examples of the expository mode in documentary film might include the documentary Blackfish, about the sort of maintenance and behavior orcas or killer whales here in the United States, or An Inconvenient Truth. So in An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore is presenting different models, in some cases data visualizations. He is the authoritative voice of God audio narration through the film. It is presented, An Inconvenient Truth is presented in story form and with a number of rhetorical proofs. So this is hopefully helps explain or frame what the expository mode is. And now we'll have you watch a documentary, a narrative video called the Mariano Rivera Cutter. This particular data narrative video presents evidence that Mariano Rivera may be one of the most successful pitchers of all time, and it presents a number of different models of his pitches to make the case that he's one of the best pitchers of all time. So I'll let you guys watch that, and then we'll talk a little bit about it when you're done.
Mariano Rivera is one of the most dominant closers in history. But what may be most remarkable is that he has done it by confounding hitters with mostly one pitch, his signature cutter. John Flaherty of the Yes Network faced Rivera as a hitter and also caught him when he played for the Yankees.
From a hitter standpoint, he's out on the mound. It feels like he's not even putting any effort into it, and the ball explodes on you. And from a catching standpoint, he's the easiest guy ever to catch because he throws the ball right where you want it.
Rivera uses a seemingly effortless delivery, which he can flawlessly repeat pitch after pitch. His cutter is thrown very much like a fastball, but the pitch has significant lateral movement. He creates and adjusts this movement with the different pressure he puts on the ball with his fingers. The pitch's lateral movement keeps it off the bat's sweet spot, moving in on the hands of a left-handed batter and toward the end of the bat of a righty. To a hitter, Rivera's cutter first appears like a straight fastball, making it hard to distinguish the two pitches during the first fractions of a second when the hitter must decide if when and where to swing. Hitters often rely on reading a pitch's spin to determine what pitch is coming, but Rivera's fastball and cutter have what appear to the hitter as the same spin. Many pitchers throw their cutters more like sliders, with their fingers pulling down on the side of the ball. This can create more downward and lateral movement than a cutter, but it also creates the signature spin of a slider, a spinning red dot, that the hitter can recognize and adjust to. With identical deliveries and spins on Rivera's pitches, hitters are at a loss to identify and then attack the pitch, until it is too late, and the balls end up in very different locations. Here are the nearly 1,300 pitches that Rivera threw in 2009, each frozen at the point when the batter must make his swing decisions. But with few clues to determine the pitch's ultimate location, the batter can be faced with guessing at these outcomes. Here are the cutters to left-handers. Here are the cutters to right-handers. And fastballs to right-handers. He throws almost no fastballs to lefties. As this map of his 2009 pitches shows, Rivera is remarkably adept at hitting the corners, keeping the ball away from the middle of the plate, the easiest spot for a batter to make good contact.
Looking from this perspective, it's not surprising that the real hot spot is inside on a lefty. I think he could hit that spot with his eyes closed.
Rivera's simple but effective formula has made him baseball's most dominant closer.
So some of the things you may have noticed from the video, there were a number of presentations of indexical evidence. So there are evidence presentations, sort of a bird's eye view or a God view from above of all the pitches that Mariano Rivera threw in a particular year, all represented as a 3D cluster. Then it showed that same view as if you were standing at home plate. The video opened with a evidence representation of pitches crossing the plate as if you were a batter. So there are a number of presentations of that indexical evidence. Through the whole thing, there's an authoritative voice of God style of narration, sort of a let me tell you about this particular subject. All of the evidence is presented as a career story. So this is the story of Mariano Rivera's career, specifically focusing in on this one pitch called the cutter, that the position or the argument that's presented in this video is that it is this particular pitch that made Rivera so unique and so successful. And then interviews are provided from different baseball players that may have played with him or played against him that had firsthand experience with the pitching, which are known as rhetorical proofs. I hope you enjoyed this particular data narrative video. Each one of the 3 different modes provides us something that's sort of unique in how you might present data visualization evidence, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Next, we'll discuss some of the principles of animation that are important when we're creating particular media of this type. So the first one, moving frames of visualization in rapid succession are basically what animation is. So if you think about having a bunch of static frames of data visualization, or even more simply, I might just have a little stick figure that I drew on the first sheet of a sticky notepad. And then on the next sheet, I drew the exact same stick figure, but he's slightly raising an arm up. And the next sheet, he's lowering his arm, and then I alternate back and forth, the raising and the lowering of his arm, each sheet beyond that. And then I took the whole pad and I just flipped it with my thumb. What we would see is basically the stick figure waving to us. Now, in truth, it's not really a stick figure that's waving to us. It's just a moving set of static images. And our mind goes ahead and puts that together fills in the blanks, if you will, that, that is a representation of a person waving to us. Okay, so the first principle is simply to understand that this is moving frames, if you'd like to think of it as static frames, of visualization presented in rapid succession. So we've got a bunch of still frames, but then we set them to motion. There are a series of visual changes between the frames. So in our simple example, the visual changes between the frames might be the stick figure raising or lowering their arm. Objects moving in the same direction and speed form groups. So think a little bit about the Hans Rosling circles that represent each country. So if we see a number of objects that are moving in the same direction, roughly the same speed, we will consider those to be groups. And to give a good example of this, think about what happened in the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. That was a very dramatic part of the Hans Rosling video. And if you don't remember, just go back and take a look at it. It happens around 1917, 1918, and you'll see a number of the circles representing those countries just drop out of the air towards the bottom of the screen. So that's a good example of objects moving in the same direction and speed forming a group. The group that was formed is all of the countries that were significantly impacted by the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. They all moved at once. They created a group among themselves, and it was very easy for us to distinguish that they were all part of that event. The other circles were not. Next, objects moving in different directions are considered isolates. So we may have some outliers. Basically, some circles in the Rosling video that don't move in the same direction. They move in an opposing direction. And so when that happens, we consider those isolates. We sort of set them off to the side in our mind as outliers and not part of the general pattern, trend, or behavior. And then also remember this principle of 5 or less. So for most humans, the ability to process what's going on with roughly 5 objects or ideas at one time is about all that we can handle. Okay, I may have a couple of different things going on in my visualization. That's fine. You know, I may have the main group that's going on, you know, coming back to the Hans Rosling video, the First World War. I had most of the countries moving in one direction, so they form one group. All the countries involved in the First World War, they move in another direction. So I only have really two major things going on in terms of what an audience has to process. But if I ramp that up and I had about 5 or 6 different things going on, now I'm pushing pretty much at the maximum level of what an audience can process. And I'll also add, this is the same principle that works in PowerPoint. Some folks may have noticed this over time, but each PowerPoint slide that we have in this course always has 6 or fewer bullet points in it. And there's a very important reason for that, that is the same driver of what a particular audience can capture in their mind at one time. You can certainly add more bullet points to a slide, but once you do, the average person is going to have to discard several of them to keep them managed in their mind. Now, a little bit of discussion about the characteristics of descriptive data visualization versus exploratory. So with descriptive, I tend to do presentation. So the data is well known to the presenter. The data has often been cleaned. There are few, if any, issues with it. And the viewer is in passive mode. So The presenter is basically driving the conversation, describing what the data set is or how the data set functions. In exploration, as a technique of exploratory data visualization, the data can be surprising. So we may make adjustments. So think about going in the interactive Gapminder visualization. We might change some of the variables. So we're no longer looking at GDP. Maybe we look at broadband communication. How many folks have access to broadband communication? We use that as a different variable. We might play it through and find some of that data to be surprising. It might move in directions we didn't expect. Data might have outliers. We might find certain overperforming or underperforming elements or countries in that particular example. Data is likely to move unpredictably, so we can't really predict what we're going to see, particularly when we're changing those variables, because by definition, we're exploring. We don't really know what to expect. And most importantly, in exploration, the viewer or the audience is controlling the interaction. Now, some of the objectives of exploratory data visualization, kind of looking at what are we trying to accomplish with each type. So if we start with the descriptive in presentation mode, we want to present fewer dimensions to make a point. So if we're trying to communicate something in a presentation, it's not going to work very well if we're trying to communicate something that involves 10 different variables and how they act on each other. It's just too complex to communicate that well at the speed of a presentation. We might walk through a couple of those dimensions. So let's say we present just a few dimensions, and then we walk through those dimensions and how they influence each other clearly. So it's a much simpler type of data visualization. We'll highlight critical points. So what's interesting, what's unique, that's what we'll focus on. And then we'll group points together to show trends and motion. Now coming over to the exploratory side and exploration, so there we can analyze multiple dimensions at once. So we might turn on 3 different dimensions like we did in the Hans Rosling interactive Gapminder. We might change mappings at many times. So I might look at one set of 3 variables, and then I might change a couple of variables and look at those. And I'm looking for trends or holes, something that's unusual that I didn't expect. We might even change the linear or logarithmic scales as I look at each of those. So as we discuss moving plotted points or bubbles as some of the visualization, the animated visualization that we looked at before, there's a couple things that can help the view. So the first one is orientation. The second one is order. So in orientation, we're maintaining the distance from the center and keeping that as constant as possible. So the idea here is to keep the rings. So in looking at the 2 diagrams to the right, the 2 visualizations to the right, so if left without constraining some of the degrees of freedom, we might have motion, say for example on the top visualization, where a particular bubble, a plotted point, might start at the bottom left and then move in sort of a angular fashion up to the top right. And that might be the particular motion that it takes if we haven't constrained some of the motion. Now that can turn into a fairly busy data visualization. And if you were to create the Gapminder visualization in native Excel, which I have done before, what ends up happening with those bubbles is they're very jumpy. You will see them jump from one plotted position to the next, which makes sense because basically what we're doing is we're just flashing one position and then the next to the next position, and it looks like it jumps. And so that's similar to what's going on here, what we're describing, that it's unconstrained, the motion that's going here. Now, one of the principles or ways that we can make this animation look much better is this orientation where we keep the rings. So if you look at the bottom here, you'll see that with the same blue point, instead of darting it across, we basically try and maintain its distance from the center as much as possible. So what you see here is that blue dot basically moves the same distance. So you see those 5 different positions, but it maintains the same distance from the center that it originally had. So it moves in kind of an arc and keeps the rings. Now the second principle is order, where we maintain consistent neighbors as much as possible. So if we look at the top diagram here, if left unconstrained, the blue plotted point at the bottom left, it shoots up to the top right. The green plotted point on the top left, it shoots down to the bottom right. And so what we end up having is sort of a crazy looking dynamic of our plotted points jumping around the screen. Now, imposing order basically means we're maintaining consistent neighbors as much as possible. So in the same way as our blue measurement moved at a consistent distance from the center, the second principle of order says that distance that was between the original plotted point of blue and green, try and keep those about the same distance from each other, basically keep the neighbors. And so you'll see in the second position and third position, the green measurement is moving fairly consistently with the blue measurement, maintaining that same distance or same neighbor as those points move. And so you'll see, this is some of the principles, the logic that's gone into the latest version of PowerView that you guys will be working with. And as the main difference, the application of these two principles is why the motion of those bubbles looks so smooth versus if you did it in native Excel, the motion would not be so smooth and they would jump around a lot, as we've discussed. So a couple more thoughts and principles about how to focus the motion in a particular animated data visualization. So one of the things that we're trying to do is help the user maintain their orientation. So when we're engaging an audience, we want them to have an understanding of where they are in this data visualization and understand kind of their place in it and have a center, if you will, sort of a balance in how they're experiencing the visualization. So we might want to animate direction in a manner that the user would expect. So a couple of examples of that. So typically when we create a data visualization with an X and Y axis, we have a built-in expectation that the X-axis is going to be time, and then it's going to move from the left to the right. Now, there isn't any rule anywhere that says, hey, you always have to put time on the X-axis. But there is a built-in expectation that that's how the arrow of time moves. So it starts at the left position and time moves to the right. And we also see that consistency in the embracing of how videos play. So pretty much universally, all of the major video hosting locations and applications on the web play video from left to right. In many cases, that video play direction has actually overcome and supplanted some deeper historical cultural expectations. And we also need to understand that there are cultural expectations at work as well. So in some parts of the world, a large part of the world, the very process of learning begins in reading top to bottom as well as left to right. Now, that's not true in every place in the world, and there are certainly exceptions to this rule, but that is a cultural expectation in some places. So understand who your audience is, what their expectation is of how movement or motion should occur in a particular visualization, and don't fight that cultural expectation. Try to use it to your advantage. And then finally, restrict motion that does not add value. So just like we were talking about in the last set of principles, we want smooth motion in our visualization. In any motion that doesn't add any value, we want to consider smoothing it or removing it from our data visualization, as long as it's an honest representation of the phenomenon. In summary, exploratory data visualization is an analytical technique. Data visualization has many objectives. It can be descriptive, so it helps us to explain something, helps us to present something. It might help us to tell a story. We can also have exploratory. So exploratory data visualization is an analytical technique. We're using navigation, drill down, all kinds of different exploratory techniques, browsing, searching, to basically analyze the data, to see what's there, see what's unique. And then finally, we can use data visualization as an effective form of communication. And that can be in many forms. It can be in a single visual frame, but it can also be in a whole series of visual frames set to motion, in an animation, or in a video. So we want to select a type of visualization that best emphasizes the insight. So if we want to have a very strong comparison, we might want to have a static descriptive data visualization. But if we want to describe a particular trend or pattern or motion in data variables, then we might want to select some sort of animated data visualization to show that pattern. And when we do, if we choose some type of animated data visualization, we want to align the motion in that animation with cultural expectations, so that we get the cultural expectations and the visual expectations working for us instead of against us. This concludes the lecture on animated and exploratory data visualization.